So I'm taking a course right now with the cultural historian Richard Tarnas on the work of Robert Bellah, the American sociologist. This was his last book, Religion and Human Evolution. Um, Bellah died not too long ago and wrote this book. It was only published in 2011, I believe, by Harvard University Press. Yeah, 2011. And I would really recommend this book um, to those members of the YouTube community, especially who are um, self-described atheists, people who are into Richard Dawkins' work, um, because Bellah really tries to situate religion within the context of not only the evolution of our species and the evolution of life on Earth, but the evolution of the cosmos, the 14 some odd billion year process um, of unfolding and complexification that has characterized the history of our universe. So, in that sense, he's trying to give ultimately a naturalistic account of religion, which is exactly what people like Dawkins and his friend, the philosopher Dennett. It's what they're trying to do, and I've written a paper on this that I'm continuing to develop and expand that talks about how religion can be naturalized. Now, what's different about Bellah and what's different about how I've tried to naturalize religion um, is that nature for Bellah is, um, well, it's a divine being, and science for Bellah is, at least when it stretches towards the whole of things, when it tries to proclaim upon the nature of the universe and the meaning of human life, then science becomes religious, right? So nature is a numinous presence, a divine being, and science is a religious activity. When it's, you know, again, reaching to answer the big questions. And I've just been watching some Richard Dawkins videos where he's interviewed and asked questions about this. Whether religion or whether science and the way that he apologizes for it is in fact a form of religion. And Dawkins is quick to say that no, science is not at all like religion because science is based on evidence, not just belief. And then he says that science is the only way we know anything about the real world, right? So science is the only way we know anything about the real world. And then the interviewer, I think, astutely follows up and asks if there's anything else important about human life that can't be reduced to science, if there are questions that science can't answer. And Dawkins basically says, no, all questions can ultimately be scientifically explained, but that some of them are just so difficult in practice that we may as well not try to give a scientific explanation. Um, and so, of course, that's a convenient way of being a scientific fundamentalist, right? And the problem here is that Dawkins is eliminating um, all other, let's say, um, lived realities or modes of existence. He's eliminating them and saying that they're all illusory, or worst, illusory, and all that's really happening is, a collection of objects is moving through a grid of space-time according to certain mathematical laws, and sometimes by accident, things that have never happened before happen, and accidents cascade, and sometimes, replicating objects, groups of objects that replicate their groupiness. I didn't want to say their form, because there's no room for formal causality in Dawkins' sort of reductionistic, materialistic metaphysics or ontology. So it's just a groupiness of objects, a sort of temporary alliance between objects that can replicate itself, and then you get life and so on. Dawkins' view of nature makes it, of course, quite miraculous that something like the human being would ever emerge. And the interviewer kind of steered Dawkins into a conversation about the special uniqueness of human beings. Once human beings emerge, as Dawkins says, I think in the end of The Selfish Gene, he says that we are unique among animals on this earth, that we can rebel against our selfish genes, that we in some way have will and culture, and that a process of mimetic evolution unfolds, allowing us to, become supernatural, it seems. So, at least we're in some sense above natural selection in Dawkins' view. So, all of a sudden, there's this weird bifurcation between human consciousness and the rest of the biological world and the universe. And, for me, this is unsatisfying philosophically. And, what Bellah tries to do in this book by situating religion in the context of hominid evolution and of mammalian evolution, and, the emergence of the capacity for empathy, care, the emergence of a sort of justice and egalitarianism in primates, and then the human symbolic form of consciousness emerging with its various cultural capacities, religion, art, science, and so forth. Bellah tries to tell a story in which what emerges later, the human, with all of its cultural activities, is coherent with and unfolds and follows naturally from what came before this, physical, biological process. And, I try to extend and expand Bellah a little bit by bringing him into dialogue with Alfred North Whitehead in my own paper, and I'll share a link to it. And what I want to say using Whitehead's ontology and his cosmology is that, when we talk about physics and biology, we're not talking about a merely mechanistic process. We're talking about a process which is already awake. In other words, it's experiential. There's desire and intention and a sort of aesthetic sense at work from the very beginning, even when we're dealing with photons and electrons. Certainly once we're dealing with atoms, stars, galaxies, living cells, there's clearly intention, there's interiority, and this isn't, we shouldn't think of this as immaterial, as somehow separate from what we observe and call physical. It's not separate from it. It's what physical matter is. Physical matter is alive, right? It's right. In scientific terms, we would say it's inherently self-organizing. That energy organizes itself. That energy is musical. It harmonizes. It intensifies, and it is creative. It never does the same thing twice, or at least, it certainly does repeat itself. There are massive habits. We call them physical laws. They're really habits that have established themselves in the course of deep time. But those habits are themselves, because they're habits, they're actually still open to change. They're not laws imposed eternally. They're habits that we can unlearn, that the universe can unlearn. So there's a sort of creative advance to evolution, as Whitehead described it. And that creativity, again, it goes all the way down. There is no mere mechanism anywhere. There is no mere dead, inert matter anywhere. Matter and mind are two ways of describing the same energetic process that is evident throughout the scale of nature, from the micro to the macro. So what Whitehead would diagnose in the thought of someone like Richard Dawkins is a fallacy, which he called the bifurcation of nature, the separation between psyche on the one hand and cosmos on the other, the separation between mind and nature. And in order to resolve that bifurcation, to dissolve that dualism, we have to sort of step back for a moment from the science versus religion culture war and try to bring culture itself to the foreground and try to understand how there's some deeper, imaginative, and in so many ways spiritual activity that is essential to being human. And it's from out of that essential core that both science and religion emerge as sort of inflections upon that original prototype. Because, I think there are good reasons to differentiate between science and religion. But at the end of the day, one without the other, especially when one tries to negate the other, it only leaves itself, either heartless or blind. So, if science severs itself from religion, it's heartless. It lacks a sense of moral depth and value, aesthetic value. Whereas if religion severs itself from science, it's blind. It's unable to evaluate facts and remains too fixated on dogmas. But we need both, our eyes and our heart. We need to be able to see and to feel. And ultimately, we need to kind of, move beyond a myopically scientific or religious worldview and arrive at a cosmology that is inclusive of, deep aesthetic feeling, or this what you could call the more romantic tendency. It's inclusive of that as well as what you might call the more enlightenment tendency, to seek a sort of a knowledge of and a skill in manipulating or at least interacting with the world outside of oneself. So the romantic form of consciousness is very introverted and sort of broods on the tragic beauty of the world and perceives that as a reality, whereas the Enlightenment consciousness is more interested in truth. It's more interested in being right and in having a clear and distinct understanding of exactly what is going on in the outside world. And to negate or neglect either of these two poles, the subject pole or the object pole, is to risk the pathology of bifurcation. It's a disease, really, and the disease has infected the human, leading us to separate ourselves from the natural world, but at the same time that it infected us, it infected the entire planet. It's not as though the human mindset has no impact on the rest of the planet, right? So mass extinction, climate change, soil erosion, the acidification of the oceans, what we're witnessing at a planetary level, the reason that the world's geologists are about to begin and name and classify a new geological era as the Anthropocene is because our species, the disease of consciousness that has infected modern industrial society, it's infected the rest of the community of life on this planet through our activities. So if we're going to cure it, it's going to involve us coming into a different kind of relationship, not just in the way that we manipulate so-called natural resources, but in the way we even come to frame our situation in those terms. We need to shift our moral relationship with the rest of the community of life on this planet, which means to come to recognize that we've always already been in a moral relationship, that those beings, human, non-human beings, have value independent of their value in the human economy, or even their value as pets or objects of our adoration. The rest of the community of life on this planet has value that is intrinsic to its own existence. Each being is a perspective, a lived reality, a felt experience of this universe, and deserves to exist. And certainly there are food chains in nature, and beings are eating each other all the time. But we see that the stable, vibrant, most diverse ecosystems are the ones in which those processes of cycling energy, eating, occur in sort of mutually enhancing, symbiotic way. And certainly human beings are not enhancing the rest of the community of life. We certainly have the power and the ingenuity to be enhancers of this planet, but right now we're destroying it. And I think that destructive behavior has everything to do with the mindset that would lead us to view nature as a machine. And until we can come to terms with the continuity between the human mind, including our scientific activity and our religious activity, the continuity of that with the universe, then we're never going to be able to turn this civilization around. So read this book. It's very accessible, and I think it'll give everyone a lot to think about. And unlike, say, Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, this is a work of scholarship. God Delusion is an ideological book. It's a book designed to win someone over to a cause, which is fine. But it's not scholarship, it's not research, it's not educational, really. This book will teach you something about the history of our world, both our human world and human history, the evolution of human religion from tribal to archaic civilizations, to the axial revolution that happened simultaneously in Israel, Greece, China, and India. And it'll again ground all of that in the evolution of our biosphere and of our universe. So it's a really grand and ambitious project, but I think Bellah more or less pulls it off. So yeah, thanks for listening, and as always, please let me know what you think.